Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob Sivas, and today we're going to discuss a carb addiction concept, and that is how your diet influences your hormones. And I get a lot of questions about from men and women, hormones. Everybody's interested in their testosterone levels and their estrogen and fat levels, and people are also looking at, why does my body look the way it does? Why have I distributed fat to the sites on my body? Why am I shaped the way I am? So we're going to talk about hormones, male and female. We're going to talk about body shape and how those two things are influenced. Folks, I am the Carb Addiction Doc, and we try to make these videos free. As part of that, please hit the subscribe button. If you like this content, hit the subscribe button, and also perhaps if you really like the content, throw us a cup of coffee at our Patreon account at CarbAddictionDoc. But here we go. So one of the interesting things that I've noticed after 21 years of being in this field, and we see thousands of patients, is the different shapes of people's bodies. And we do a ton of blood work testing. And over the years, pattern recognition has become very important. Most doctors do not test to look at causation, to look at how the body systems integrate. Most doctors do blood work to find things that they can throw medication at. And they really don't understand the value of looking at how the systems integrate. Well, we've done that. And what's interesting is I gave a talk to the Lipedema Society. I would strongly recommend you go and look that up, the Lipedema Society of America. And at that talk, we talked about a particular body shape in mostly females, but also men, which is this excess amount of fat in the buttocks, in the thighs, in the lower part of the body with a very thin upper body. Why does that occur? And what was interesting is there were a group of us on the panel, and one of the people I'd never met was somebody from Germany who works in a lipedema clinic, and they completely corroborated these findings when it came to the hormonal and genetic aspects of lipedema body distribution pattern. But I'm going to take this further. I'm going to discuss every one of the common body shapes, body sizes when it comes to the standard American diet. So here's the way it works, folks. When you eat a carbohydrate-rich diet, and on average, the standard American diet has evolved into something where people are eating between 60 and 80% of all their calories as carbohydrates, and they're also eating multiple times a day. It's not just the concept of consuming carbohydrates, it's also the increased amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids, the decrease in saturated fat, and the frequency by which we eat. 3 or 4 meals a day plus a whole bunch of snacks. We've got this continuous tide coming in that the body has to deal with. So the first issue is that excess sugar, that excess carbohydrate, is rapidly turned into fat by the liver and then shipped out for storage. And it goes to adipocytes, it goes to fat cells. And there really are 3 areas or 3 places where the body typically stores large amounts of excess fat. The first obvious one is globally in all of the fat cells, particularly the fat cells under the skin. In our subcutaneous tissue, we've got a huge number of fat cells. And it's not that the fat cells increase in number or decrease in number. That's a pretty fixed thing, although there's some work being done on increasing fat cell volume or the number of fat cells. However, those fat cells can either look like raisins all shriveled up or like big juicy grapes filled up with fat. So it's not the number of cells, it's how much fat they contain. And the first place where we add a lot of fat is subcutaneously. And those people are globally fat. Think about something like an Eskimo. If you look at Eskimos, they're very healthy, the hunter-gatherer Eskimos, but they have global fat deposition, and we'll explore that body composition. The second place where we store fat under particular conditions is the lipedema population. I've mentioned that briefly, which is where all the fat is stored in the lower half of the body, the buttocks, the thighs, the legs, and these folks have very, very large, at an early age, you can see this almost in newborn babies or shortly thereafter, a large buttocks, large thighs, but it really becomes prevalent at various stages in life. One is shortly after the beginning of adolescence, after menarche, where women start having their periods or boys sexually mature, during and after childbirth, and after menopause in females. So we'll explore that body distribution. And then the third body distribution of fat, which occurs mostly in men, but certainly we see it in females as well, is intra-abdominal and what I call visceral fat. Fat inside our bellies, inside our chest, inside of our bodies, within the skeleton. So you've got fat on the outside of the skeleton in the subcutaneous tissue, which is the first type. We've got the lipedema, which is the lower distribution of fat. And then the third one is intra-abdominal and intrathoracic visceral fat. And that includes fat around the deep subcutaneous tissues of the neck, the face. So we get areas of fat deposition within and around organs. And the question is, why is that the case, and how harmful are the different types? Well, here's what's interesting, is that when you eat a lot of carbohydrates, and the root cause of all of this, is chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption, folks. Chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption. Because there is value, historically, to storing fat. It helped us to get through difficult winters. And that fat storage, at least two of those fat storage types, the lipedema type and the global fatness, had biologic protectiveness and also environmental protectiveness. It seems pretty obvious that if you live in a very hot climate around the equator, you don't want to have fat everywhere because you're going to sweat and not deal well with heat. It's better to keep that fat in your lower body. Think, for example, of the Bushmen or the Khoisan people from my part of the world who have large buttocks and thighs, especially the women. They store their fat there, yet their upper body is lean for heat management. At the same time, I mentioned the Eskimos or the Inuit before. They have global fat deposition. Think about a walrus, for example. Very healthy animal, but extremely obese everywhere, from its face to its tail. And that's because it's an insulation effect in the very cold climates. So genetically and evolutionarily, we've adapted those different types of fat deposition patterns. Now, obviously, we've distributed those genes throughout our culture, so they can occur anywhere from the poles to the equator now, and it's all mixed in. But those genetic trends run true, and we can actually measure the effects of that genetic distribution, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The harmful, the toxic fat distribution is that occurs around organs, intra-abdominally, intrathoracically, in the neck. And we'll talk about why that is dangerous as well. Okay? And it's actually not, and here's a little important concept to understand. Because it's so obvious that fat inside the belly equates with heart attacks and strokes. So it must be the fat in our bellies and around our organs that is dangerous, that's bad, that's causing those heart attacks and strokes. No, folks. It's not that simple. And this is so important about human biology. The fat around our organs doesn't cause the damage. It's the systems, the hormonal systems, that allow fat or encourage fat to be concentrated around our organs that also, in parallel, cause damage. It isn't the fat that causes the damage. The fat is associated with damage, but it is not causal. So if you see someone with a big belly and a big jowly neck, you can assume they've got, and I know assumptions can be bad, but they have metabolic syndrome, and it's the metabolic syndrome that is dangerous. Not the distribution of fat. The distribution of fat is just an indicator that there's a problem. Okay, so let's go through this. And here's what's been really, really cool that we've seen in our office. So first of all, subcutaneous and lipidemic fat distribution. I'll call it the Inuit or the Eskimo type and the Bushman type, just to give you those visuals, okay? Those are healthy forms of fat distribution. And people with stage 1, stage 2 lipedema are incredibly healthier than most people. People that collect subcutaneous fatty tissue are actually very healthy when they are overweight, but not when they're morbidly obese. In other words, stage 3 and stage 4 lipedema, where you've now massively increased your fat and you've got lymphedema as well as lipedema, which is the obstruction of lymphatics, that becomes a disease. So over excess causes disease. So does that occur when you are massively obese, when the fat is distributed everywhere. But you're actually healthier than someone with the fat distributed just inside the belly and chest. So the ability to store fat subcutaneously is a protective and healthy mechanism because it helps us to get through very, very lean times of the year. So there's a survival part to that. But when it becomes excessive, that can become damaging as well. So what is the benefit of that and how is it driven? It is driven, obviously, as we said, by the consumption of carbohydrates. But carbohydrates aren't bad. While they may not be necessary for human survival, there was historically a survival benefit. So when you eat a moderate amount of carbohydrates, you tolerate a degree of low-end insulin resistance where your insulin levels go up, but you still are able to distribute. You're still able to distribute that sugar very rapidly out of the bloodstream. Remember, sugar in the bloodstream causes disease. We'll get back to that. Distribute it very quickly via the liver, where the liver converts it to fat, and the fat cells themselves, it's called de novo lipogenesis, DNL. The fat cells themselves, under certain hormonal conditions, will also convert sugar to fat. So we've got this rapid conversion of sugar to fat. Yes, your insulin levels are elevated, but they're not elevated to the point that they cause harm. And that's important because where insulin causes harm is when your insulin levels are elevated all the time and they block certain steroid hormonal production. So here's the cool part. When we analyze women with lipedema and women who are globally fat, those two relationships are related to hormones. In the case of the lipedema population, they have high estrogen or estradiol being the active form of estrogen, high estradiol levels, whether they're pre or postmenopausal. Yeah, postmenopausal women still produce estrogen, but those estrogen levels are high, their progesterone levels are low, and their testosterone levels are low. So we see in lipedema patients high estrogen, low progesterone, low testosterone, and the fat distribution then is in the lower half of the body. And we call that the lipedema distribution. In the gynecoid distribution, what is gynecoid? Female shape, which is where the fat is everywhere, your Inuit or your Eskimo type population. We have in the females, again, high estrogen levels, but now we also have high progesterone levels. And we actually test estradiol, not estrogen. So your estrogen levels are elevated, your progesterone levels are high, and your testosterone levels are low. In addition, your glycogen levels, which nobody really tests because they can't treat it, your glycogen levels are low and your insulin levels are moderately elevated. Moderately elevated. So those are conditions of low testosterone, is subcutaneous fat distribution. So the one thing to remember is if your testosterone is low, you're getting subcutaneous fat distribution, and then based on progesterone and estrogen, it may be in the lipidemic distribution, it may be in the global gynecoid or female-shaped pattern. Now, again, this is in females. There is a disease that we call PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. And PCOS, another word for it is what we call the androgen system or androgenic fat distribution. Androgenic being masculine or male-based. And when we look at our PCOS patients, they're often infertile, they have a lot of secondary hair growth, hirsutism, and they have a particular fat distribution. They have a thicker skin, a ruddy skin, and they have distribution of the fat internal to the skeleton, around the organs, around the heart, maybe the jowls and the face, and there's a particular androgenic distribution of fat. And when we look at their hormones, they have low estradiol. Whether they are pre or postmenopausal, they have low estradiol, they have high progesterone, and they have very low testosterone levels. I'm sorry, wrong. They have ultra high testosterone levels. So they are high testosterone levels, which give them the androgenic or male distribution, low estrogen, and high progesterone. That means that they don't have normal period cycles. They're the cysts. Where does PCOS come from? It's the observation that in the ovaries, these women will develop a whole bunch of cysts. Now, how does the ovary work? Well, the ovary produces one little egg, one little oocyte. And that oocyte develops in a cell, and the cell slowly accumulates water or fluid to the point that it bursts, and it releases that cell. That's fertility. And that is governed by estrogen and progesterone cycling around day 14 of a normal cycle. Don't want to go too far down the gynecologic side. However, if those eggs swell and swell and swell and you don't get the estrogen progesterone cycling, the cell doesn't burst. It sits there, and you can see that as the swollen cyst in the ovary. And the next month you get another one, next month you get another one. Every month you're getting one of these things. And when you ultrasound the ovaries, you see these multiple cystic swellings of eggs that were never released. And that's why we call it polycystic ovarian syndrome. And the reason for that, folks, is high testosterone, low estrogen, and high progesterone. And that is polycystic ovarian syndrome. It is the androgenic distribution. And those women have fat around their organs. And that high testosterone, that elevated testosterone, is also associated with very high insulin. Those women are typically high insulin producers, and they also have high glycogen, which means not high glycogen, high glucagon. So their insulin levels are high, their glucagon levels are high, their testosterone levels are high, and that is a very, very dangerous complex of hormonal changes. And the reason for that is because the effects of elevated insulin and the production of sugar by glycogen, even in the face of elevated blood sugar, causes huge harm to the human body. And mostly through intravascular clotting. So your risk of a heart attack, your risk of a stroke goes up. In addition, your steroid hormones are completely screwed up because insulin blocks the conversion of cholesterol downstream to the steroid hormones. So your cortisol levels, your adrenocorticoid levels, your steroid hormone levels, your human growth hormone levels, your vitamin D levels are all in the toilet. But your testosterone levels are high because you've blocked the conversion of cholesterol downstream to estrogen, and it diverts in females toward testosterone. Now, on the flip side, let's look at the men. The men with a gynecoid distribution, which look, the typical eunuch, if you know what a eunuch is, it's somebody who's had their testicles removed, and they look gynecoid. They've got these fluffy, fat under the subcutaneous tissue, and you see fat men with all that subcutaneous fat, which is actually not that bad. I'd rather take a gynecoid distribution than an android distribution in terms of health for a male. But in those men, they have peripheral conversion of DHEA to estrogen. They have peripheral conversion of estrogen in those fat cells. They have a very high level of estrogen, and their testosterone is super low. Testosterone levels are very low. On the other hand, when you have men that look like your typical beer belly, they've got the big jowls, they've got the tiny little skinny legs, I call them the avocado men. If you take an avocado pip and you put two or three toothpicks in it so that you can grow the avocado, that's kind of what they look like, these large bellies and these tiny little skinny legs, but all the fat is on the inside. And their bellies may be really rock hard with very little subcutaneous fat, but all the fat, when you operate on them, it's just the sea of fat inside their bellies. That's the android or androgenic distribution. In those men, they typically have low estrogen, very high testosterone, but they have that distribution, and that androgenic distribution is correlated with the highest level of mortality and morbidity danger because those people have metabolic syndrome. They have metabolic syndrome. Those folks have high levels of insulin resistance, they have hypertension, they have intravascular clotting, and they have their risk of heart attacks, of strokes, is through the roof. Now, how do you correct that? Don't eat carbohydrates. There's no medication that can fix this, folks. There's no medication that can fix this. We sometimes use metformin to treat the high levels of glucagon for a while as your body resets itself, as you get used to that insulin resistance. But when we're dealing with our lipidemic population, they are extremely good at converting anything they eat very, very rapidly into fat. So the greatest challenge for our lipidemic patients is radical caloric deficiency, radical caloric restriction, which is extremely difficult to do, and certainly no carbohydrates. So living on protein and fat, but very small amounts of food, as seldom as you possibly can. And that's one of the reasons I strongly advocate for bariatric surgery, for caloric reduction surgery, restrictive bariatric surgery in people with lipedema who are willing to give up their carbohydrates. You're not willing to give up the carbohydrates, don't have the surgery. So under those conditions, that's what I advocate for. For my PCOS population, the females with PCOS, come off the carbohydrates, get yourself on metformin. And the greatest complication I see in my PCOS population in the first year after surgery, after coming into the practice, they don't need surgery necessarily, but the first year after the practice is they get pregnant. Oh, I haven't had a period in 10 years. I've been told I can't get, boom, pregnant. 12% of my fertile females with PCOS get pregnant in the first year after they start a ketogenic diet, get off the carbohydrates, because their hormones regulate themselves. They get cycles and they sit on a warm toilet seat, because nobody ever has sex. They sit on a warm toilet seat and then they come in 3 months later, they've gained some weight. Why? Because they have a bump. Obviously, if you suffer from infertility and you're trying to get pregnant, that's the way to go. And we counsel a lot of patients with PCOS for that. But folks, especially PCOS ladies, when you come off carbohydrates, make sure the man wears a hat or you go on birth control, because you will get pregnant and you don't necessarily want that. Make that decision. And for our gynecoid patients, we also use a combination of an ultra-low carbohydrate diet and global caloric reduction, although that's perhaps where physical activity in some of those conditions may actually help that gynecoid population. Certainly surgery helps to a certain extent, but it's a very, very transient effect. If the slope of the curve is, you don't want the slope of the curve of the weight loss to be too steep, avoid surgery, but that's where you can do this yourself by sustaining that way of life. Coming off the carbohydrates and allowing hormonal regulation to occur is absolutely fine. My greatest concern with a PCOS group of patients and with the males with the androgenic distribution is how much time do you have before a catastrophic event intervenes? How much time do you have while you're making this correction to avoid the heart attack or the stroke? Now, if you're 20 years old and that's what you look like, it's all about what you're eating and drinking. But when you get into your 50s and 60s, so much damage has happened over time. The risk of dying, the risk of having a catastrophic heart attack or a stroke is very, very high. And that's where you do want to steepen that slope of the curve. And we've got several strategies by which we can do that. But understanding your hormones and getting tested, looking at insulin, looking at C-peptide, looking at glucagon, looking at estrogen, testosterone, and looking at progesterone. Those are critically important in terms of understanding how your body functions and what best pathway of dietary manipulation and hormonal manipulation to go on. And for all those men taking testosterone, that's fine. You might look like Arnold Schwarzenegger in Mr. Olympia. However, think of the damage it's doing on the inside. And you're oblivious to that damage. It's not really measurable. So you look like a god, and then you drop dead. Be careful. Testosterone supplementation, I use it from time to time very transiently, but we want to be very, very aware that testosterone supplementation is just there to carry you over while you correct your natural testosterone production. I've seen people go from under 100 testosterone levels to over 800 in the space of 1 year to 18 months just with dietary manipulation. That's how powerful it is. But in order to do that, we have to restore insulin sensitivity, which means coming off carbohydrates. I know this has been a very technical discussion. And certainly if you have one of those conditions, now you understand, and we can cater specifically to your biologic condition, to how your body responds genetically to your excessive consumption of carbohydrates. It's really, really cool to figure this out, and we can definitely help. Give us a shout. Either text us to 561-517-0642 or email us or make some comments and ask for help. I typically go through the comments the first couple of days that these videos drop, and I'll respond to you. But reach out to us, we can help. And it's not just keto for all. There are specific ways in which we can help you to understand your own biology and make those differences. Please leave comments below. If there's value to this discussion, if you've had that aha moment, buy us a cup of coffee on our Patreon account at CarbAddictionDoc. But please also subscribe to these video channels. There's more to come. Thank you.